It is roughly 30,000 years ago, and winter is settling over the limestone valleys of what we now call southwestern France. The air is sharp enough to sting your lungs, smelling of damp earth, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of a cold river. Inside a shallow cave, a woman is sitting on a bed of dried grasses. She isn't frantic. She isn't panicking about her mortgage or checking a calendar to see if she has a meeting at 9 a.m. She is slowly, methodically rubbing a piece of mammoth ivory against a flat sandstone rock. She has been doing this for 3 hours. Outside, the sun is beginning to dip, casting long purple shadows across the tundra. She isn't working a job. She isn't earning her survival. She is simply existing in a version of time that we, in our modern world, have almost entirely forgotten how to inhabit. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That for 99% of our history, the concept of a career would have been as nonsensical as the concept of a weekend. But if they didn't have jobs, what on earth did they do once the sun came up? Think about your last Monday morning. The alarm goes off, your brain immediately starts cataloging threats, unanswered emails, a looming deadline, the rent that's due on the 1st. We live in a world defined by the grind, a perpetual state of productive anxiety. We've been taught that this is just the human condition, that life has always been a brutal, exhausting scramble for resources. We imagine our ancestors waking up in a state of survival horror, spending every waking second desperately trying not to starve or get eaten by something with bigger teeth. But what if that's just a story we told ourselves to make the 40-hour work week feel more natural? What if, in reality, the people we call primitive actually had more leisure time than a modern billionaire? But if their lives weren't a constant struggle for survival, how did they actually spend those empty hours? The first person to really pull the rug out from under our assumptions was an anthropologist named Marshall Sahlins. In 1966, he presented a paper that fundamentally changed how we view prehistory. He called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society. Now, affluent usually makes us think of yachts and designer watches, but Sahlins argued that true affluence isn't about having a lot of stuff. It's about having everything you need while still having an abundance of the one thing money can't buy: time. Sahlins looked at data from groups like the Jew/Hawanzi in the Kalahari and the Hadza in Tanzania. He found that these people, living in environments we would consider harsh and unforgiving, only worked about 15 to 20 hours a week. That's it. In about 3 hours a day, they could gather enough tubers, nuts, and small game to feed everyone. The rest of the day was theirs. It was a 15-hour work week, 10,000 years before the invention of the office. But if the work was done by lunch, what filled the silence of the afternoon? For an ancient human, the afternoon wasn't a time to squeeze in a workout or run errands. It was the peak of the social season, every single day. Anthropologist Nurit Bird-David describes this as living in a giving environment. In our world, we see nature as a set of resources to be managed and extracted. To a hunter-gatherer, the forest or the savanna was more like a generous relative. You didn't have to earn the berries. They were just there. This lack of pressure meant that the primary activity of the day wasn't labor, it was conversation. We're talkers by design. Robin Dunbar, a researcher at Oxford, famously proposed that language didn't evolve so we could give technical instructions on how to build a spear. It evolved so we could gossip. He called it social grooming. Just like chimpanzees spend hours picking bugs out of each other's fur to build alliances, humans started using words to do the same thing. But why would a species spend so much energy just chatting about who was annoyed with whom? Because in a world with no police, no laws, and no fences, your social standing was your only safety net. If the group liked you, you ate. If the group didn't, you were in trouble. So an ancient human's job was essentially maintaining their social network. They spent hours laughing, telling stories, and debating the merits of different members of the tribe. They were experts in the nuances of human behavior because they had the time to sit and watch each other. They weren't just killing time, they were weaving the fabric of the community. When you find yourself leaning over a cubicle wall to whisper about a weird email your boss sent, you aren't being lazy. You are engaging in an ancient, essential human ritual that predates the invention of the wheel. But what happened when the talking stopped and the sun finally went down? In our world, the end of the day is a frantic race to wind down before an 8-hour sleep block. But for our ancestors, the night was a completely different country. Historian Roger E. Kirch found overwhelming evidence that before the Industrial Revolution, humans didn't sleep in one big chunk. They practiced something called biphasic sleep. They'd go to bed around dusk, sleep for 4 hours, and then wake up around midnight. This wasn't insomnia, it was a scheduled break. For 2 hours in the middle of the night, the camp would come alive. People would stoke the fire, share a small snack, have sex, or just sit in the darkness and reflect. This quiet watch was considered the most peaceful and creative time of the day. It was a time for deep thought, for dreaming while awake, and for connecting with the spiritual world. We've traded those 2 hours of midnight magic for a consolidated block of unconsciousness, so we can be more efficient at our desks the next morning. But if they weren't focused on efficiency, how did they manage to create things that still haunt us today? We often use the word Stone Age to mean something crude or simple, but if you actually try to make a stone tool, you'll realize very quickly how wrong that is. It's called flint knapping, and it's not just hitting 2 rocks together. It is a highly skilled, high-stakes game of physics. You have to understand the way waves of force travel through silicate stone. One wrong strike, 1 degree off in your angle, and the entire blade shatters. Researchers have estimated that it takes hundreds of hours of practice to become a master napper. This was their hobby. They would sit for hours in the shade, carefully flaking obsidian or flint into blades so sharp they can still outcut a modern steel scalpel. They had the luxury of craftsmanship. They weren't making disposable things. They were making objects that were meant to last a lifetime. And they had the time to make them beautiful. But was all that effort just for tools, or did they have an itch for something more? Think about the Lion Man of Hohensteinstadel. It's a sculpture found in a German cave, carved from a mammoth ivory tusk. It's about 40,000 years old, and it depicts a human body with a lion's head. Archaeologist Wolf Hein did an experiment to see how long it would take to recreate it using only the tools available at the time. It took him over 400 hours. That is 10 full work weeks spent on a single figurine that provides 0 calories, 0 warmth, and 0 protection. Why would someone do that? Because they could. Because they had the unproductive hours to follow a vision to its end. They decorated their bodies with beads made from shells traded from hundreds of miles away. They painted horses on cave walls that seemed to gallop when you move a torch past them. They were artists who didn't have to worry about a side hustle. But if they spent so much time on art and gossip, how did the children learn how to actually stay alive? In the modern world, we ship our children off to schools for 12 to 16 years to prepare them for the real world. In the ancient world, the real world was the classroom, and the primary method of instruction was play. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy talks about alloparenting, the idea that in hunter-gatherer societies, children weren't just raised by their parents, they were raised by the whole group, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and older siblings. This meant children were constantly surrounded by a variety of role models. They didn't have recess because their whole life was an unstructured exploration. They played at hunting, played at gathering, and played at social negotiation. They learned the complex grammar of the natural world by being in it, not by reading about it. They were experts in botany by age 7. Not because they studied it, but because they spent their afternoons looking for the right roots with their grandmother. But was this life of leisure only for the young and the healthy? One of the most beautiful things we find in the archaeological record is evidence of deep, prolonged care. At a site called Cima de los Huesos in Spain, researchers found the skull of a child who lived 500,000 years ago. The child had a condition called craniosynostosis, where the skull fuses too early, causing brain deformation. This child wouldn't have been able to keep up or contribute to the group in any physical way. And yet, the bones show the child lived to be about 8 years old. In a world as brutal as we imagine prehistory to be, that child shouldn't have survived a month. But they did, because someone carried them. Someone fed them. Someone spent their free time making sure a life that offered no ROI was still protected. We find skeletons of elderly Neanderthals with healed broken hips and missing teeth. People who couldn't hunt, but who were clearly fed and valued for years after their physical utility had ended. Their job was to be the memory of the tribe, and the tribe felt that was worth the extra calories. But if the group was so focused on care and leisure, how did they handle the moments when they actually had to find food? This brings us to the one part of ancient life that actually looks like hard work: the hunt. But even this wasn't work in the way we think of it. It was an elite athletic event. Before we had bows or guns, we had persistence hunting. This is a strategy based on a very specific biological hack. Humans sweat, and most other animals don't. A kudu or a zebra is much faster than you in a sprint, but it has to stop to pant to cool down. A human doesn't. We are essentially mobile radiators. An ancient hunter would find an animal and just keep walking toward it for hours, through the heat of the midday sun. Every time the animal tried to rest, the human would appear on the horizon, moving at a steady, relentless trot. Eventually, the animal's core temperature would rise so high that its muscles would simply seize up. It would collapse from heat stroke, and the hunter would walk up and finish it. But why would anyone choose such a grueling way to get a meal? Because we are literally built for it. Biologists like Daniel Lieberman have pointed out that our bodies are a collection of running adaptations. We have the nuchal ligament in our necks to keep our heads steady while we run. We have the gluteus maximus, the biggest muscle in the human body, which is barely used for walking, but is essential for stabilization during a run. We have millions of eccrine sweat glands that no other primate possesses. We are the marathon runners of the animal kingdom. For an ancient human, a 5-hour pursuit through the savannah wasn't a chore. It was the ultimate expression of what their body was designed to do. It was a high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled version of the runner's high we pay gym memberships to try and catch a glimpse of. They didn't have to find time to exercise. Their survival was an exercise in biological perfection. But if they were so perfectly adapted, why did they ever stop living this way? It's the great mystery of human history. About 10,000 years ago, we started settling down. We started farming. We traded the 15-hour work week for the sun-up to sundown labor of the fields. We traded the variety of the forest for the monotony of wheat and barley. We traded the giving environment for the owning environment. And with ownership came hierarchy. And with hierarchy came the concept of working for someone else. We became more productive, sure. We built cities and pyramids and eventually iPhones. But we also introduced malnutrition, epidemic diseases, and the chronic stress of status competition. We became a species that lives in a constant state of future panic, always working for a tomorrow that never quite feels secure enough. But is it possible that our modern brains are still back in that French cave, wondering why the lights are still on? Think about the way we feel when we sit around a campfire. There's a reason why, even in the age of Netflix, we can stare at a flickering flame for hours without getting bored. There's a reason why walking in nature is the #1 recommendation for stressed-out professionals. We are trying to find our way back to the default state of our species. We are designed for long conversations, for biphasic sleep, for craftsmanship that takes as long as it takes, and for the deep satisfaction of moving our bodies through a landscape. We aren't lazy when we want to do nothing. We are simply experiencing a biological longing for the world we spent 300,000 years perfecting. We are a species of elite leisure seekers who accidentally built ourselves a cage of perpetual labor. But what if the most productive thing they did all day was actually the thing we value the least? We live in a culture that treats boredom as a failure. If you have 5 minutes of downtime, you pull out your phone to fill it. But for an ancient human, boredom was the fertile soil of the mind. It was in those long, empty afternoons that they made the connections that led to the first myths, the first medicinal discoveries, and the first inklings of what we now call science. They observed the patterns of the stars, not because they had to navigate to a meeting, but because they were sitting there looking at them. They learned which bark cured a headache because they had the time to experiment and observe. Our modern world is loud, fast, and crowded, but it's also remarkably shallow. We know a little bit about 1,000 things, but we've lost the deep, quiet intimacy with our environment that defined our ancestors. They didn't have jobs, but they were never unemployed. They were fully engaged in the business of being human, which is a much bigger task than being a, quote, professional. But if their life was so much better, why does the thought of it feel so terrifying to us? We've become so accustomed to the comforts of our modern world, the climate control, the instant calories, the antibiotics, that we find it hard to imagine value in a life that didn't have them. We see their lack of, quote, stuff as a tragedy. But a hunter-gatherer would look at our lives and see a different kind of tragedy. They would see people who spend the best years of their lives sitting in chairs, staring at glowing rectangles, working for the benefit of people they've never met to buy things they don't have time to use. They would see a species that has conquered the world but lost its own sense of time. They would wonder why we are so busy, quote, surviving, that we've forgotten how to live. But could we ever truly go back to that way of being? Probably not. There are 8 billion of us now, and the giving environment can't support that kind of density. We are committed to the path of agriculture and industry. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from the ghost of that woman in the cave. We can acknowledge that our work-life balance is a modern hallucination. We can recognize that our bodies and brains are still tuned to the frequency of the Pleistocene. We can try to carve out little campfires in our own lives, times when the phone is away, the clock is ignored, and we are just talking, just being, just existing in the way we were designed to exist for hundreds of thousands of years. We can remember that we aren't just workers or consumers. We are the descendants of the most successful leisure class in the history of the planet. But if we are the masters of time, why does it always feel like we're running out of it? The answer is as simple as it is uncomfortable. We've been sold a version of progress that measures success by how much we can produce rather than how much we can enjoy. We've created a system where the reward for working hard is usually just more work. We've forgotten that the goal of technology was supposed to be the liberation of our time, not the tethering of it. Ancient humans didn't have jobs because they didn't need them to feel useful. They were useful because they were present. They were useful because they were part of a tribe. They were useful because they were alive. In our rush to build a world that works, we might have accidentally built a world that doesn't let us be human. But if the ancient world was so much more relaxed, why do we keep choosing this one? We choose it because we are afraid of the silence. We are afraid of what we might hear if we sat around a fire for 6 hours with nothing to do but think. We've filled our lives with noise and to-do lists to avoid the heavy, quiet realization that most of what we do doesn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things. Our ancestors didn't have that fear because they weren't trying to leave a mark on the world through their career. They were the mark. Their songs, their stories, and their presence were enough. They lived in a world that was complete, and they were complete within it. They didn't need to become someone. They already were. But what if the most revolutionary thing you could do today is absolutely nothing at all? What if, for 1 hour, you ignored the grind and just sat? No podcast, no book, no screen, just you and the air and the sounds of the world. You'd probably feel anxious. You'd feel like you were wasting time. But that anxiety is just the ghost of the Industrial Revolution whispering in your ear. It's the voice of a system that needs you to be productive to survive. If you can push past that, you might find something else. You might find a flicker of that ancient prehistoric peace. You might find the version of yourself that lived for 300,000 years before the first clock was ever built. You might find that you don't actually need a job to have a life. It's a long way from a limestone cave in France to a high-rise office in a modern city, but the biology hasn't changed. We are still the same creatures who sat by the fire and gossiped about the hunters. We are still the same creatures who woke up at 2 a.m. to share a quiet moment in the dark. We are still the same creatures who felt a deep, instinctive joy in the rhythmic work of making something beautiful with our hands. The job is a new invention, a temporary experiment in the long history of our species. And like any experiment, it's worth asking if it's actually working. Or if, perhaps, we've spent the last 10,000 years making a very, very busy mistake. Because here is the cold, undeniable fact that we spend our entire modern lives trying to outrun. You are a biological machine designed for a world that no longer exists. Your brain is wired to expect 3 hours of work and 12 hours of social connection. But you are giving it the exact opposite. You are living in a sensory environment that is fundamentally incompatible with your DNA. Evolution doesn't care about your promotion, your followers, or your credit score. It cares about your cortisol levels. And right now, yours are screaming that something is wrong. We tell ourselves we are the masters of the earth because we paved it, but the reality is simpler and far more haunting. We are just the only animal on the planet that has successfully tricked itself into building its own zoo, and then volunteered to spend 40 hours a week cleaning the cage. We don't have jobs because we're more advanced than our ancestors. We have jobs because we've lost the ability to survive the freedom they considered their birthright.